Homeless boy returns millionaire's wallet, but when he sees his mother's picture inside. The biting cold of a harsh winter morning nipped at Tommy's exposed fingers as he rummaged through a dumpster behind Gino's Pizzeria. At just 12 years old, Tommy had already mastered the art of urban foraging, a skill no child should ever need to learn. His tattered gloves, more holes than fabric at this point, did little to protect his hands from the chill or the grime, but he pressed on, driven by a gnawing hunger that had become his constant companion. As he pushed aside soggy cardboard boxes and empty cans, his eyes lit up at the sight of a half-eaten pizza, miraculously preserved in its grease-stained box. To Tommy, it was a feast fit for a king. He clutched the box to his chest, his prize hard-won after hours of searching, and scurried back to the abandoned building he currently called home. The derelict structure loomed before him, 5-story testament to urban decay. Windows were boarded up haphazardly, some with plywood, others with sheets of corrugated metal. Graffiti adorned the walls, a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to mock the grayness of Tommy's existence. He slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence surrounding the property, ducking under a sign that read "Condemned" in bold red letters. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with the musty scent of neglect. Tommy navigated the debris-strewn hallway with practiced ease, avoiding the spots where the floorboards had rotted through. His room was on the second floor, former office space that still had 3 walls intact and a portion of the ceiling that didn't leak too badly when it rained. As he settled onto his makeshift bed, a collection of flattened cardboard boxes covered with a threadbare blanket, Tommy allowed himself a small smile. Pizza was still warm, and as he took his first bite, closed his eyes, savoring the flavors that danced across his tongue. For a moment, he could almost forget the harsh reality of his circumstances. But reality had a way of creeping back in, no matter how hard he tried to push it away. As he ate, his eyes wandered to the only personal possession he had managed to hold on to through years of hardship. Small, cracked picture frame that held a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. His mother. Tommy's story, like many tales of tragedy, began with love and hope. Sarah Evans had been barely more than a child herself when she gave birth to Tommy. At 17, she found herself alone and scared, abandoned by Tommy's father before he was even born. But Sarah was determined to give her son the best life she could. For the first few years, they had managed. Sarah worked 2 jobs, scraping together enough money to rent a small apartment in a not-too-bad part of town. She would come home exhausted, her feet aching from hours of waiting tables, but she always had a smile and a hug for her little boy. Tommy's earliest memories were of those moments. His mother's warm embrace, the scent of the cheap perfume she wore, and the sound of her voice as she read him bedtime stories. But life has a way of testing even the strongest souls. When Tommy was 6, Sarah fell ill. At first, she tried to hide it, pushing through the fatigue and the pain. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that this was more than just a passing bug. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was devastating. Aggressive cancer that had already spread to multiple organs. The next 2 years were a blur of hospital visits, mounting medical bills, and Sarah's steady decline. Tommy watched helplessly as his vibrant, loving mother withered away before his eyes. Despite her condition, Sarah fought hard, determined to stay alive for her son. But in the end, the cancer proved too formidable an opponent. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, with 8-year-old Tommy holding her hand, Sarah Evans took her last breath. Her final words to her son were a whispered "I love you," and a promise that she would always watch over him. In the aftermath of Sarah's death, Tommy's world fell apart. With no known relatives to take him in, he became a ward of the state, thrust into the often cold machinery of the foster care system. The next few years saw him bounced from one foster home to another, never staying in one place long enough to form any real connections. Some homes were merely indifferent, treating Tommy as little more than a paycheck from the government. Others were actively hostile, with foster parents who saw the quiet, grief-stricken boy as an easy target for their frustrations. In one particularly harrowing placement, Tommy endured months of verbal and physical abuse before finally gathering the courage to run away. That first night on the streets had been terrifying. Tommy huddled in an alleyway, jumping at every sound, convinced that each passing shadow was a threat. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, he learned to navigate the harsh realities of life on the fringes of society. He fell in with a group of other homeless youths, learning from them the survival skills that would keep him alive. They taught him how to find the safest places to sleep, which shelters were best avoided, how to panhandle without attracting too much attention from the authorities. Tommy was a quick study, his natural intelligence sharpened by necessity. But even as he adapted to his new life, Tommy never lost sight of who he was or where he came from. A photo of his mother remained his most prized possession, a tangible link to a happier past and a reminder of the love that had shaped his early years. On the hardest days, when hunger gnawed at his belly and the cold seemed to seep into his very bones, Tommy would take out the photo and talk to it, telling his mother about his day and imagining what advice she might give. Now, as he finished the last of his scavenged pizza, Tommy carefully wiped his hands on his jeans before picking up the photo frame. "I miss you, Mom," he whispered, his finger tracing the outline of Sarah's face. "I hope you're not too disappointed in me. I'm trying. I really am." A tear slid down his cheek, leaving a clean trail through the grime on his face. Tommy quickly wiped it away, sniffling. He couldn't afford to be soft, not in this world. Survival required a certain hardness, a willingness to do what needed to be done. As the weak winter sunlight began to fade, Tommy tucked the photo safely into his backpack, a battered thing he'd found in a donation bin outside a church. Tomorrow would be another day of scrounging for food, avoiding the authorities, and trying to stay warm. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to remember the warmth of his mother's love and to dream of a better future. Little did Tommy know that fate was about to deal him a hand that would change everything. In the bustling streets of the city, a chance encounter was brewing, one that would connect his past, present, and future in ways he could never have imagined. Following morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of winter day that looked beautiful from behind a window, but bit at exposed skin with vicious intent. Tommy stirred from his fitful sleep, his body aching from the hard floor and the cold that seemed to seep through the very walls of the abandoned building. He went through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. A quick wash with some bottled water, change into the cleanest clothes he had, which wasn't saying much, and a careful check of his few possessions. The photo of his mother went into the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his heart. As he stepped out onto the street, Tommy pulled his threadbare coat tighter around himself and began his daily journey. His first stop was always the same: small bakery 3 blocks away. Old Mr. Gennaro, the owner, was one of the few people in the city who showed any kindness to the homeless boy. Each morning, he would leave a paper bag with day-old bread and pastries behind the shop, turning a blind eye when Tommy quickly snatched it up. Today, however, as Tommy rounded the corner to the alley behind the bakery, he saw something that made his heart sink. A police car was parked in front of the shop, its lights flashing silently. Through the window, he could see Mr. Gennaro talking to 2 officers, gesticulating wildly. Tommy's stomach churned with a mix of hunger and worry. Had something happened to the kind old baker? Or worse, had someone reported Mr. Gennaro for helping the local street rats, as some of the less charitable shopkeepers called them? Not willing to risk being seen, Tommy reluctantly turned away. He would have to find breakfast elsewhere today. With a heavy heart, he made his way towards the busier part of the city, where he knew he'd have a better chance of panhandling or finding discarded food. The streets gradually filled with the morning rush. Men and women in smart business attire, clutching steaming cups of coffee as they hurried to their offices. Tommy weaved through the crowd, invisible to most, a nuisance to some, and an object of pity to a rare few. He had just settled into his usual spot, a corner near the entrance of the subway station, and he heard a commotion. A sleek black town car had pulled up to the curb, and a well-dressed man emerged, talking loudly on his cell phone. No, tell them the meeting's been pushed to 3 p.m. I don't care if they're flying in from Tokyo, they'll have to wait. I've got more important matters to attend to." The man barked into his phone. Tommy watched with mild interest as the man strode towards the entrance of a towering office building. He was tall and imposing, with salt and pepper hair and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, from his tailored suit to his shiny leather shoes. Just as the man reached the revolving doors, a gust of wind whipped down the street. In that moment, several things happened at once. The man's grip on his phone loosened as he reached to steady his tie. The device slipped from his hand, clattering to the sidewalk. And from his coat pocket, dislodged by the sudden movement, leather wallet tumbled out. The wealthy man, cursing under his breath, bent to retrieve his phone. In doing so, he failed to notice the wallet lying just a few feet away. Without thinking, Tommy sprang into action. His survival instincts, honed by years on the street, screamed at him to grab the wallet and run. It could mean food for weeks, maybe even a warm place to sleep, but something held him back. A memory of his mother's voice echoed in his mind. Honesty, Tommy. It's all we truly have in this world. Before he could change his mind, Tommy darted forward, scooped up the wallet, and called out, Sir, you dropped this." The man turned, his face a mask of surprise and suspicion, as he saw the scruffy boy holding out his wallet. For a moment, he seemed frozen in place, as if unable to comprehend what was happening. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the wallet from Tommy's outstretched hand. You're returning this to me?" the man asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and something else Tommy couldn't quite identify. Tommy nodded, already regretting his decision, as his empty stomach growled in protest. "Yes, sir. It fell out of your pocket when you dropped your phone." The man stared at Tommy for what felt like an eternity, piercing blue eyes seeming to look right through the boy. Then, to Tommy's utter astonishment, the stern face softened, and the hint of a smile tugged at the corners of the man's mouth. "What's your name, son?" he asked, his tone gentler now. "Tommy, sir. Tommy Evans." The man's eyebrows shot up at this, a look of shock crossing his features so quickly that Tommy almost thought he'd imagined it. "Tommy Evans," the man repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "Well, Tommy Evans, you've done me a great service today. This wallet contains some very important documents. I'd like to reward you for your honesty." Or Tommy could protest. The man had pulled out a crisp $100 bill and was holding it out to him. It was more money than Tommy had seen in months. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for it, half expecting the man to snatch it away at the last second. But the bill was pressed into his palm, and Tommy's fingers closed around it reflexively. "Thank you, sir," he managed to stammer out. The man nodded, that almost smile playing on his lips again. "You're welcome, Tommy. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting to attend." With that, he turned and strode into the building, leaving a stunned Tommy standing on the sidewalk, clutching the $100 bill as if it might disappear at any moment. For several minutes, Tommy stood rooted to the spot, his mind whirling. The growling of his stomach finally snapped him out of his daze. Food. He could buy real food now, not just scraps from dumpsters. Maybe even get a new pair of shoes or a warmer coat. As he turned to head towards the nearest diner, a flash of white caught his eye. There, lying on the ground where the man had been standing, was a small rectangular piece of paper. Tommy bent to pick it up, thinking it might be another dropped document he could return. But as he turned it over in his hands, his heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a document at all. It was a photograph. And staring back at him from the creased and faded image was a face he knew as well as his own. His mother's. Tommy's mind reeled. How? Why did this wealthy stranger have a picture of his mother? The photo was old, showing Sarah as a young woman, perhaps not much older than Tommy was now. She was smiling, her arms wrapped around a young man Tommy didn't recognize. Questions flooded Tommy's mind, threatening to overwhelm him. Who was the man in the photo with his mother? Why did the wealthy businessman have this picture? And most importantly, what did it all mean? Tommy looked up at the towering office building, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun. Somewhere inside was a man who might have answers to questions Tommy hadn't even known he had. But how could he get to him? Would the man even want to talk to a homeless kid like him? As he stood there, torn between the urge to run and the desperate need for answers, Tommy didn't realize that his life was about to change forever. The threads of past and present were about to intertwine in ways he could never have imagined, setting in motion a chain of events that would unravel the mystery of his own identity and challenge everything he thought he knew about his past. With trembling hands, Tommy carefully tucked the photograph into his pocket, right next to the one of his mother he always carried. Then, taking a deep breath, he squared his shoulders and walked towards the entrance of the imposing building. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but he was determined to find out. The truth about his mother, and perhaps about himself, lay somewhere beyond those revolving doors, and Tommy Evans was not about to let this chance slip away. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the revolving doors of the towering office building. The glossy marble floors and gleaming brass fixtures of the lobby stood in stark contrast to his worn sneakers and tattered clothes. He felt acutely out of place, drawing curious and sometimes disapproving glances from the well-dressed people bustling about. Swallowing hard, he approached the reception desk, where a stern-looking woman eyed him suspiciously. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone making it clear that she doubted she could. "I need to speak with the man who just came in," Tommy stammered. "Tall guy, gray hair, expensive suit. Really important." The receptionist's frown deepened. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Hawthorne doesn't take unscheduled meetings, especially not with—" She paused, giving Tommy a once-over, "uninvited guests." "Please," Tommy pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "I have something of his, something important." He pulled out the photograph, careful not to let it out of his grasp. "See, it has his picture in it. I need to return it to him." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly as she caught a glimpse of the photo. For a moment, she seemed to waver, professional demeanor cracking just a bit. "Wait here," she said finally, picking up her phone. Tommy stood nervously by the desk, acutely aware of the stares he was attracting. He could hear the receptionist's hushed voice as she spoke into the phone, though he couldn't make out the words. After what felt like an eternity, she hung up and turned back to him. "Mr. Hawthorne will see you," she said, sounding as surprised as Tommy felt. "Take the elevator to the top floor. His assistant will meet you there." Mumbling a thank you, Tommy made his way to the elevator, his legs feeling like jelly. As the car ascended, he tried to calm his racing thoughts. What was he going to say? How would he explain finding the photo? And most importantly, what answers would he find? The elevator doors opened to reveal a plush hallway leading to a set of imposing double doors. A young woman in a crisp suit was waiting for him, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "This way, please," she said, leading Tommy to the doors. He knocked once, then opened them, ushering Tommy inside. The office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city. But Tommy barely noticed any of it. His attention was fixed solely on the man standing behind a massive desk, Mr. Hawthorne, the stranger from the street who now held the key to Tommy's past. "So," Mr. Hawthorne said, his piercing blue eyes studying Tommy intently, "you found something else of mine, did you?" Tommy nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. With shaking hands, he pulled out the photograph and held it out. I found this on the sidewalk after you left. I thought you'd want it back, but..." Trailed off, unsure how to continue. Mr. Hawthorne took the photo, his expression unreadable as he looked at it. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then, with a deep sigh, the man sank into his chair, suddenly looking much older and more vulnerable than he had on the street. "I suppose," he said quietly, "that you recognized someone in this picture?" Tommy nodded again. "My mother," whispered. "The woman in the photo, that's my mom. But she's so young, and I don't know the man she's with. Sir, can you tell me, how do you have this picture?" Mr. Hawthorne closed his eyes briefly, as if steeling himself for what was to come. When he opened them again, they were filled with a mixture of pain and resolution. "The man in that photo," he said slowly, "is me. And the woman, well, I think you've probably guessed by now. That's Sarah Evans." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Tommy struggled to process this information. You knew my mother?" he managed to choke out. A sad smile played at the corners of Mr. Hawthorne's mouth. "Knew her? Oh, Tommy, I loved her. She was everything to me, and I was a damned fool who let her go." As if a dam had broken, words began to pour out of Mr. Hawthorne. He told Tommy of how he had met Sarah when they were both young. He, a promising business student from a wealthy family, she a vibrant free spirit working her way through community college. They had fallen in love hard and fast, much to the disapproval of his family. "We were so happy," Mr. Hawthorne said, his eyes distant with memory. "But I was weak. When my father threatened to cut me off, to ruin Sarah's chances at finishing her degree, I gave in. I broke things off with her, told her I didn't love her anymore. It was the biggest mistake of my life." Tommy listened, spellbound, as Mr. Hawthorne recounted how he had thrown himself into his work after the breakup, building his business empire as a way to numb the pain of losing Sarah. It wasn't until years later that he had tried to find her again, only to discover she had passed away. "I hired private investigators, but all they could tell me was that she had died and left behind a son," Mr. Hawthorne continued. "I've been searching for you for years, Tommy. I knew Sarah had named her child Thomas. It was her father's name, but I could never find any trace of you in the system." Tommy's mind was reeling. But why? Why were you looking for me?" Hawthorne leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Because, Tommy, I'm your father." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. Mr. Hawthorne, his father, quickly came around the desk, guiding Tommy to a chair. "I know this is a lot to take in," said gently, "and I know I have no right to expect anything from you. But when I saw you on the street today, when you told me your name, I knew. I knew who you were, and I couldn't let you disappear again." Tears were streaming down Tommy's face now, years of pent-up emotion breaking free. "Why?" Choked out. "Why did you leave us? Do you know what happened to Mom? Do you know what happened to me after she died?" Grief etched deep lines in Mr. Hawthorne's face. "I didn't know, Tommy. I swear to you, I didn't know about you until after Sarah was gone. If I had known..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I can never undo the hurt I've caused, but if you'll let me, I want to try to make things right." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Tommy's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, hope, fear. He thought of his mother, of the struggles they had faced together, of the years of loneliness and hardship that followed her death. And he thought of the man before him, this stranger who was his father, who had caused so much pain, but now offered a chance at, what? Redemption? A family? Finally, Tommy looked up, meeting Mr. Hawthorne's anxious gaze. I don't know if I can forgive you," he said honestly. "Not yet, but I think I'd like to try to understand, to know the whole story." Relief flooded Mr. Hawthorne's features. "That's all I can ask for," he said softly. "Thank you, Tommy." As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, father and son began to talk in earnest. They had years of history to unravel, wounds to heal, and a tentative future to explore. Neither of them knew exactly where this path would lead. For the first time in a very long time, both Tommy and Mr. Hawthorne felt a spark of hope for what lay ahead. The truth had been uncovered. The real journey was only just beginning. As they talked, neither of them noticed the ghost of a smile that seemed to play across the face of the young woman in the old photograph. Sarah Evans, watching over her son and the man she had once loved, as they took their first steps towards becoming a family. The days following Tommy's unexpected reunion with his father were a whirlwind of emotions and adjustment. Mr. Hawthorne, or Richard, as he had asked Tommy to call him, had immediately insisted that Tommy come to live with him. The transition from the streets to a luxurious penthouse apartment was jarring, to say the least. Tommy's first night in his new room, he barely slept. The bed was too soft, the silence too complete. He found himself on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, back pressed against the wall, a habit born from years of needing to protect himself while he slept. The ghosts of his past weren't so easily banished by Egyptian cotton sheets and memory foam mattresses. Richard, for his part, was trying his best to make amends and bridge the vast gulf between them. He arranged for Tommy to see the best doctors, ensuring years of neglected health issues were addressed. A tutor was hired to help Tommy catch up on his education, with the goal of eventually enrolling him in school. But despite these gestures, tension simmered beneath the surface. Tommy struggled to reconcile the image of the caring father Richard was trying to be with the man who had abandoned his mother all those years ago. The years of hardship Tommy had endured weren't easily forgotten, and he often found himself bristling at Richard's attempts to parent him. One particularly tense evening, about a month after Tommy had moved in, things came to a head over dinner. Richard had been talking about plans for Tommy's future. College prep, internships at his company, the kind of life he had always envisioned for his son. Tommy, feeling overwhelmed and resentful, finally snapped. "Stop it," he shouted, slamming his fork down. "Just stop trying to plan out my whole life. You don't even know me." Richard looked stunned. "Tommy, I'm just trying to give you the opportunities you deserve." "Opportunities?" Tommy laughed bitterly. "Where were these opportunities when Mom was working herself to death to keep a roof over our heads? Where were they when I was sleeping in abandoned buildings and digging through dumpsters for food?" Color drained from Richard's face. "Son, I told you I didn't know." "Don't call me that," Tommy interrupted, pushing away from the table. "You don't get to just show up and be my dad after all this time. You don't get to pretend the last 12 years didn't happen." With that, Tommy stormed out of the dining room, leaving a devastated Richard behind. He ran to his room, slamming the door and sliding down against it, his body shaking with sobs. All the pain, anger, and confusion he'd been holding back came pouring out. Hours later, a soft knock on the door roused Tommy from a fitful sleep. He had cried himself out and dozed off on the floor, his face streaked with dried tears. "Tommy?" Richard's voice came through the door, hesitant and filled with concern. "Can we talk, please?" For a moment, Tommy considered ignoring him. But something in Richard's tone, a vulnerability he hadn't heard before, made him reconsider. Slowly, he stood and opened the door. Richard looked as if he had aged years in the span of a few hours. His eyes were red-rimmed, his usually immaculate hair disheveled. In his hands, he held a battered shoebox. "I think," Richard said softly, "it's time I showed you something." Tommy stepped aside, allowing Richard to enter the room. They sat on the edge of the bed, the shoebox between them. With trembling hands, Richard opened it, revealing a collection of letters, photographs, and small mementos. "After I left your mother," Richard began, his voice thick with emotion, "I tried to convince myself I had done the right thing, that we were too different, that it would never have worked. But the truth is, I was a coward. I let my father's expectations and my own fears drive me away from the best thing that had ever happened to me." He pulled out a stack of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. "I wrote to her, every week for a year. But I never sent them. I was too ashamed, too afraid of her rejection. And then, when I finally worked up the courage to find her again, it was too late." Tommy listened, his anger slowly giving way to a complex mix of emotions, as Richard shared the story of his regret, his search for Sarah and Tommy, and the guilt that had haunted him for years. The box contained pieces of a life unlived, concert tickets for shows they had planned to attend, a small velvet ring box that had never been opened, photos of Sarah that Tommy had never seen before. As the night wore on, they talked, really talked for the first time. Tommy shared stories of his life with Sarah, the good times and the bad. He told Richard about the struggles after her death, the foster homes, and his life on the streets. Richard listened, his heart breaking with each revelation, but never turning away from the painful truth of what his actions had wrought. Dawn was breaking by the time they fell into an exhausted silence. The air between them felt different. Not healed, not yet, perhaps beginning to mend. "I know I can never make up for the past," Richard said finally, his voice hoarse from talking and emotion. "And I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Whatever you need, time, space, anything, just tell me. I want to be a part of your life, Tommy, in whatever way you'll allow." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, turning one of the old photos over in his hands. Finally, he looked up at Richard, his eyes filled with a mix of caution and hope. I think I'd like to try. To get to know you, I mean. But I need you to understand, I'm not the son you imagined all these years. I'm me, with all my rough edges and bad habits. I don't know if I'll ever be the polished businessman you wanted, and I need that to be okay." Richard nodded, a small sad smile on his face. "Tommy, all I want is for you to be you. The rest, we'll figure it out together. If you'll let me, I'd like to get to know the amazing young man you've become, not some imaginary ideal." It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still hurdles to overcome, trust to be built, and wounds to be healed. But as they sat there, surrounded by the fragments of a shared past and the tentative hope for a shared future, both Tommy and Richard felt the first real stirrings of a bond between them. The road ahead would not be easy. Tommy would struggle with the lingering effects of his years on the street: nightmares, trust issues, and habits that were hard to break. Richard would have to learn patience, to set aside his own expectations and truly listen to and support his son. There would be setbacks and arguments, moments of doubt and frustration, but there would also be breakthroughs. First time Tommy genuinely laughed at one of Richard's terrible dad jokes. The day Richard, guided by Tommy, volunteered at a homeless shelter, began to truly understand the world his son had come from. The night Tommy, plagued by memories, allowed Richard to sit with him and offer comfort. Slowly, day by day, they began to build something new. Not a perfect father-son relationship, but a real one. Messy, complicated, infinitely precious. As spring turned to summer, the penthouse that had once felt like a gilded cage to Tommy began to feel more like home. And Richard, who had spent years chasing success and accolades, discovered that the greatest joy in his life was simply being there for his son. The challenges were far from over. For the first time in a very long time, both Tommy and Richard faced the future with hope, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the seasons changed and a year passed since that fateful day on the street, Tommy and Richard found themselves settling into a new rhythm of life. The journey hadn't been easy, but the bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, nurtured by shared experiences, open communication, and a mutual desire to heal the wounds of the past. On a crisp autumn morning, Tommy stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. Today marked a significant milestone, his first day of high school. After months of intensive tutoring and hard work, he had caught up enough to enroll as a freshman at a prestigious private school. "You look very handsome," Richard said from the doorway, his voice filled with pride. "How are you feeling?" Tommy turned, a mix of excitement and anxiety on his face. "Nervous," he admitted. "What if I can't keep up? What if the other kids find out about, my past?" Richard stepped forward, placing his hands on Tommy's shoulders. "You are one of the brightest, most resilient people I know," he said firmly. "You've overcome more in your young life than most people face in a lifetime. This is just another challenge, and I know you're up for it." Tommy nodded, drawing strength from his father's words. It still felt strange sometimes, having someone to rely on, but he was gradually learning to trust in Richard's support. As they drove to the school, Tommy's mind wandered back over the events of the past year. He thought about the therapy sessions that had helped him process his trauma and begin to heal. He remembered the day Richard had taken him to visit Sarah's grave. How they had stood there together, sharing memories and shedding tears. He thought about the homeless shelter where they now volunteered regularly, Richard using his business acumen to help improve operations, while Tommy connected with and mentored the young people there. It had been Tommy's idea, born from a desire to give back and to help his father understand the realities of life on the streets. The car pulled up to the school, an imposing brick building with manicured lawn. Tommy took a deep breath, hand on the door handle. "Wait," Richard said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "I wanted to give you this. Good luck." Tommy unwrapped it carefully to reveal a sleek, expensive-looking watch, but it was the engraving on the back that caught his eye. To Tommy, "Your mother's courage, your own strength. Love, Dad." Tears pricked at Tommy's eyes as he fastened the watch around his wrist. "Thanks, Dad," he said, the words still new but feeling right on his tongue. Richard smiled, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "You've got this, son, and remember, I'm just a phone call away if you need anything." As Tommy walked towards the school entrance, his head held high, Richard watched with a mixture of pride and wistfulness. He couldn't help but think of Sarah, wishing she could see the remarkable young man their son had become. The day passed in a blur for Tommy. New faces, challenging classes, whole world of experiences he had once thought forever out of reach. There were moments of self-doubt, times when he felt the gulf between his past and his present acutely. But there were also moments of triumph, answering a difficult question in math class, making a potential friend during lunch. When the final bell rang, Tommy emerged from the school feeling exhausted, oddly exhilarated. He spotted Richard's car and walked towards it, a small smile playing on his lips. "So," Richard asked as Tommy slid into the passenger seat, "how was it?" Tommy considered for a moment. "It was a lot," he said finally, "but I think I'm going to like it." Richard nodded, understanding the weight of those simple words. "I'm proud of you, Tommy, more than you know." As they drove home, Tommy found himself talking animatedly about his day. Interesting history lesson, the daunting English assignment, the kid in chemistry class who had invited him to join a study group. Richard listened attentively, his heart swelling with joy at seeing his son so engaged and alive. That evening, after dinner, they sat in the living room, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows. Tommy was working on his homework, while Richard reviewed some business documents. The comfortable silence between them was a testament to how far they had come. "Dad?" Tommy said suddenly, looking up from his textbook. "Yes. I've been thinking about Mom, about how she always wanted to finish her degree but never got the chance because of, well, everything." Tommy paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was wondering if maybe we could set up some kind of scholarship in her name, for single parents trying to go back to school. You think that's something we could do?" Richard felt a lump form in his throat. In that moment, he saw so much of Sarah in Tommy. Compassion, her desire to help others. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said softly. "Your mother would be so proud of you for thinking of it." Tommy smiled, a bittersweet expression that held both sadness for what was lost and hope for the future. "I just want her to be remembered, you know? And maybe help other kids not have to go through what I did." "We'll make it happen," Richard promised. "Together." As they began to discuss the details of the scholarship, Richard marveled at the journey that had brought them to this point. From a chance encounter on a busy street to this moment of shared purpose and love, it had been a path filled with pain, joy, and profound growth. The photograph that had started it all, the one of young Sarah and Richard, now sat framed on the mantelpiece, a reminder of where they had come from. But it was no longer a source of regret or pain. Instead, it stood as a testament to the enduring power of love and the possibility of redemption. Tommy and Richard's story was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead. The complexities of adolescence, ongoing process of healing, the navigation of their evolving relationship. But they faced the future with hope and determination, knowing that whatever came their way, they would face it as a family. As night fell over the city, penthouse that had once felt so empty to Richard and so foreign to Tommy was filled with the warmth of shared laughter and dreams for the future. The homeless boy and the millionaire had found not just each other, but a new beginning. Chance to rewrite their story and create a legacy of love, understanding, and compassion that would ripple out to touch countless other lives. In the end, it wasn't wealth or status that had brought healing and happiness. It was the simple, profound truth that family, whether born from blood or forged through love and choice, had the power to overcome the deepest wounds and light the way towards a brighter tomorrow.